Was Jack the Ripper a royal prince? The story that he was Prince Albert Victor, eldest son of the future Edward VII, and the then second in line for the throne, has been around since at least the mid-20th century. But how credible is it really? This is History Calling, where I bring you new videos every week on all aspects of the past, and today we're going to look at one of the most famous and brutal crime sprees in recorded history, and at just one of the conspiracy theories it has spawned. The story of the Jack the Ripper crimes is well known. In the space of barely 10 weeks in the late summer and autumn of 1888, an unknown man murdered at least 5 women in the Whitechapel area of London, all of whom worked as prostitutes, and he mutilated their bodies to varying degrees. These 5 canonical victims, and he is suspected by some of having killed others, were Ann Nichols, killed on the 31st of August, Annie Chapman, killed on the 8th of September, Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, both murdered on the 30th of September, and Mary Jane Kelly, who was horribly butchered on the 9th of November. No one was ever identified as the murderer, and witness statements from those who saw the victims with their presumed killer varied considerably. Some claimed he had a fair complexion with dark hair. One woman thought he looked foreign and had a foreign accent too. Some thought he was well dressed, even shabby genteel. Others thought he was not. One mentioned a deerstalker hat, another a peaked cap, another a sailor hat. He was apparently anywhere from 30 to 40 years old, and his height was variously placed between 5 feet 6 inches and 5 feet 9 inches, depending on who you spoke to. Several also mentioned him as having a moustache. It has been postulated too that he may have had some background in butchery or medicine because of the injuries he inflicted on his victims and the removal of some of their organs. The reasons his crimes came to an end in Whitechapel are unknown, but the most likely explanations are that he was dead, incarcerated, or had moved on somewhere else. Now we come to Prince Albert Victor, known as Eddie to his family and friends. Born in 1864, he was the eldest son of the Prince and Princess of Wales, the future King Edward VII and Queen Alexandra, and the grandson of Queen Victoria. This made him the second in line to the throne, and the man who should in fact have become king. Sadly, it wasn't to be. Albert Victor had just become engaged to Princess Mary of Teck in late 1891, only to succumb to a combination of influenza and pneumonia and die at Sandringham House on the 14th of January 1892. He was barely 28. So now that we have an understanding of the basic outline of the Ripper crimes and of who Prince Albert Victor was, let's get to the juicy part of the video. How did these two men ever become associated with one another? If you Google this story, you'll likely read that the first mention of the prince's name in connection with the crimes was made in 1970, in an article published in the Criminologist magazine and written by a medical doctor called Thomas Stowell. This is not in fact true, though it is how the story gained prominence. There is at least one earlier mention of this theory in a French book published in 1962 on Edward VII, in which the author says, and this is a translation obviously, "The young man's bad reputation," this is referring to Prince Albert Victor, "spread among public opinion. It was rumoured that he was Jack the Ripper. Others will attribute the crimes of Whitechapel to the Duke of Bedford." The information wasn't sourced, and I'm unaware of any public rumours that Albert Victor was connected with the crimes predating this. The man who was the Duke of Bedford in 1888, by the way, was 68 and 69 years old at the time of the murders, so on that basis alone, I think we can discount this slander against him, as that is well beyond the age range given by witnesses. As I said though, it was the Stowell article in late 1970 which really gave this story legs. Unfortunately, the Criminologist magazine, which was evidently not peer-reviewed or fact-checked, seems to have had a small print run, and I was unable to locate a digitised copy of the article in question. This isn't ideal, but I found a scanned copy of its first page, published in another journal actually, whose name wasn't given, plus plenty of quotes and its core arguments cited in secondary sources. So I can still tell you what Stowell claimed and didn't claim, and the evidence he said he had. First of all, he didn't name Prince Albert Victor in the article. He simply referred to his suspect by the letter S. He gave clues to his identity, though, calling the supposed murderer an heir to power and wealth, who came from a family who, quote, had for 50 years earned the love and admiration of large numbers of people by its devotion to power and service. In 1888, it had been almost exactly 50 years since the prince's grandmother, Queen Victoria, had come to the throne in 1837 and begun the Victorian age. He suggested that the prince liked to wear deerstalker hats and could have learnt the rudimentary skills of disembowelment by seeing deer hunted, killed, and cut up for eating. He also said that the man he claimed was the killer went on a cruise with his parents after the murders, which mirrored Prince Albert Victor's trip to India with the Prince and Princess of Wales in 1889. Despite some discrepancies, like the statement that S gave up his commission in the army at the age of 24 and completely lost his mind in 1889, neither of which fit the prince, there still isn't really anyone else who answers the description as well as him. Other authors have tried to say that perhaps Stowell was thinking of someone in the prince's circle whose name began with an S, but that doesn't tally with his account of a person who was an heir to power and wealth from a family that could really only be the royals. Furthermore, another author who has written about the Ripper case, named Colin Wilson, later described in a book I'll leave details of below, having had meetings and phone conversations with Stowell as early as 1960, in which the doctor unequivocally stated that his suspect was Prince Albert Victor. There is very little doubt that this is who he was taking aim at, and the conflicting information in his story could be put down to shoddy research into the prince's life or clumsy attempts to disguise Albert Victor's identity. According to Stowell, the prince had contracted an STD, perhaps syphilis, at a young age from a prostitute. He was then driven insane by it, and this explained his murderous rampages as an act of revenge against prostitutes in general, despite the fact that Stowell also claimed the prince caught his illness from a male partner. It was this disease, he said, which eventually killed His Royal Highness in a mental home, and not the effects of flu and pneumonia. As for why Prince Albert Victor was never caught, the establishment hushed it all up, of course, to avoid the scandal. So just to be clear, the argument was that Albert Victor was crazy, and this accounts for him being a serial killer. However, he was sane enough to only target prostitutes, not murder anyone closer to home, even though that would have been far handier, carry out public engagements, pose for engagement photos a few weeks before his death, and hide his insanity from the rest of the world so effectively that no one outside the family and medical team noticed that the second in line to the throne had lost his marbles, become a slasher, and ended his days in an asylum. Right. This special group of family and doctors then pulled off a wildly effective cover-up, lasting years and including dozens of people at an absolute minimum, who all managed to keep their mouths shut for the rest of their lives. We'll exclude the thousands who would have seen the prince at public events during the final years of his life, when he was apparently criminally insane, because presumably they are just supposed to have thought him no more than eccentric. Stowell's supposed evidence for this fantastical story were the papers of royal physician Dr. Sir William Gull. Gull's son-in-law, Theodore Ackland, was a former colleague of Stowell, and it was through this connection that he had apparently been asked by Ackland's wife, Caroline Gull, to look at her father's papers in the 1930s. Unfortunately, these papers were never produced, and their existence and content never corroborated by anyone else. More on that in a couple of minutes. Soon after the article was published, it was picked up by the mainstream newspapers and created a media storm. The Sunday Times almost immediately realised that the suspect had to be Albert Victor, and said so on the 1st of November. Now, admittedly, there are a few similarities between the prince's physical appearance and that of the Ripper, most notably a moustache and dark hair, and Albert Victor also seems to have suffered from STDs during his life, so that probably wasn't invented. However, he was only 24 years old in 1888, nowhere near his 30s or 40s, which was the age range given by witnesses who saw the murderer. And completely aside from that, there is a mountain of very solid evidence that Stoll's claims were a complete fantasy. Above all, Prince Albert Victor wasn't in London on the dates of the murders. He had alibis for all 4 of the kill dates, which are confirmed by a combination of the court circulars and private papers, including Queen Victoria's own diary. On the 31st of August, he was staying with Viscount Down at Danby Lodge in Yorkshire. On the 8th of September, he was at Cavalry Barracks in York. 3 weeks later, on the 30th of September, he was at Balmoral in the Scottish Highlands with Prince Henry of Battenberg and had lunch with the Queen herself. On the 9th of November, he was at Sandringham with his family, celebrating his father's birthday, which was on that very day, and included a ball that night. None of the sources mention him having just arrived from London or rushing off to get there. The newspapers were able to locate and cite much of the relevant evidence within days of Stoll's article going public, which indicates how little external research he'd done, or that he just wasn't willing to discuss anything which undermined his theory, and apparently hoped no one would notice the glaring holes in it. These are classic problems with pseudo and amateur historians, by the way, and even occasionally with trained historians who just want to get attention by making up something stupid to sell books and appear to think that everyone else is as stupid as they are. See my videos on the fake stories about Anne Boleyn being pregnant at the time of her death, which resulted from a terribly botched reading of a primary source, and a portrait which likely shows Catherine Howard instead being called Anne of Cleves, an argument the author could only make by blatantly ignoring an eyewitness account which said that Anne was blonde. For another example of medical doctors showing why they shouldn't attempt to be historians any more than I should attempt to perform surgery, see my video on whether Henry VIII was brain damaged. They're all linked below for you. Stoll, who I suspect wrote this ridiculous article to get attention, now gave an interview to the BBC show 24 Hours on the 2nd of November, in which he apparently did not dispute that Albert Victor was the man he described in his article. Unfortunately, I couldn't find this interview online, and it may not have been saved, as many old TV broadcasts at the time were not. But the Times newspaper said he, quote, seemed to accept tacitly that it was the prince, but stopped short of making an outright claim. As the backlash grew, however, he seems to have realised that he'd bitten off far more than he could chew, and began to attempt to walk his story back. On the 10th of November, a statement from him appeared in the Times which said that, I have at no time associated His Royal Highness the late Duke of Clarence, a title the prince was granted in 1890, with the Whitechapel murderer, or suggested that the murderer was of royal blood. It remains my opinion that he was a scion of a noble family. He signed himself a loyalist and a royalist, and dated the letter the 5th of November. It was to be the last public comment he ever made on the matter. By the time it was published, he was dead, having passed away on the 8th, perhaps because of the sudden and intense pressure put on him. Before anyone starts screaming murder and cover-up, though, the man was 85 years old, and there was never the slightest claim that he died of anything but natural causes. What is odd, arguably suspicious, and at the very least a short-sighted thing to do, and one which has allowed this story to mushroom cloud into the monster it has become, was the decision of his next of kin to apparently burn all his papers relating to the Ripper case right away, mostly unread. His son, Eldon Stoll, explained this on the 14th of November by saying, I read just sufficient to make certain that there was nothing of importance. The family decided that this was the right thing to do. I am not prepared to discuss our grounds for doing so. My father left no instructions or request on what we were to do with it, meaning a file containing his notes. I note that he had been interested in this subject for many years, and that it arose again recently. For what reason, I don't know. This decision to destroy the notes provoked so much criticism that Eldon Stoll's brother-in-law was moved to publish his own statement on the 19th of November, defending his relation, and saying that the explanation of his so doing is actually quite straightforward. My brother-in-law is a man of honour. Whether that honour was directed towards protecting the royal family or the reputation of Thomas Stoll, he didn't say. We might try to pass this off as the result of a grieving family desperate to draw a line under the whole debacle and not tarnish their husband and father's reputation any further by allowing people to see how weak his story was. Alternatively, perhaps there never were any notes and the only way to cover for Stoll lying was to say the papers had been destroyed. Either way, the claim that there was a source, which was then deliberately destroyed in the days after Stoll's death, has only proved to be fodder for the conspiracy nuts, despite the fact that even if we're very generous and say that Stoll did have something written by Sir William Gull, that wouldn't mean that the content of any such papers was actually true. Now that Albert Victor's name was firmly associated with the Ripper, the floodgates were open for yet more lies to be spread about the deceased prince, and another, equally implausible story concerning him appeared in a BBC television show called The Ripper File in 1973, and was repeated, with some extra flourishes, in a book called Jack the Ripper, The Final Solution by journalist Stephen Knight in 1976. It was even the basis for a Johnny Depp and Heather Graham movie about the killings released in 2001, which I can't say the title of because YouTube classes it as a swear word. I'll leave details in the description box for you though. Before I get to that crazy story, if you're enjoying this content and would like to get more from me, please remember to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel with the notification bell switched on so that YouTube knows you approve and will keep you up to date with all my content releases. I also have a Patreon page where I share bonus material, including early access to ad-free videos, mini podcasts, blog posts, and more. Finally, you can check out my Amazon storefront, where I've collected together lists of history-themed books, TV shows, movies, and more, which I think you'll like. Both are linked below for you, as is my Instagram account. Thank you too to those of you who support the channel using the thanks button underneath videos, as your generosity is very kind, always appreciated, and as with my patrons, helps me to keep doing what I'm doing. The BBC show and Mr. Knight claimed that the prince had become acquainted with the artist Walter Sickert. There's no evidence to support that, by the way. Then, in 1884, he impregnated one of Sickert's young models, a Catholic shopgirl called Annie Crook, by whom he had a daughter named Alice in 1885. He even married Annie, with Sickert as one of the witnesses, and wait for it, Mary Kelly, future Ripper victim, as another. When the higher-ups in the government and the royal family found out, Annie was put into an asylum and subjected to brain surgery to destroy her memory, while the toddler Alice was sent to live with Mary Kelly. Mary couldn't keep her mouth shut about the whole thing though, blabbed it to other prostitutes, then they all got together to blackmail the royals, and so the family, with the support of the government, had the 71-year-old Sir William Gull, who had had an incapacitating stroke the year before, by the way, ride around London in a carriage with a driver called Netley, slaughtering the blackmailers and killing Catherine Eddowes along the way because he mistook her for Mary Kelly. The gruesome nature of the killings was all part of some twisted Masonic ritual, because when in doubt, blame a secret organisation, even though it's clearly not actually secret. Knight claimed Sickert was in on it too and was the Ripper as well, so there were two of them. After Kelly was killed, little Alice ended up back with Sickert, grew up, became his mistress, and eventually became mother to his supposed son, Joseph, who just happens to have been the so-called source for this whole ludicrous tale. I feel like I shouldn't even have to go through the main reasons why this is all rubbish, but I know if I don't, I'll get people in the comments lapping it up like it's gospel, so here goes. First and foremost, there's zero evidence to support any of this claptrap. That in itself should be enough. There's no marriage certificate for Albert Victor and Annie Crook. He wasn't in the country at the time Alice would have been conceived, and there's no evidence that Joseph, whose real name was Joseph Gorman, not Joseph Sickert, was Walter Sickert's child, especially as he was born during his mother's marriage to another man. Furthermore, Joseph later admitted he made the whole Ripper connection up, though he continued to pretend to be the prince's grandson. Knight refused to accept this and continued to peddle his pack of lies about Sir William Gull in later publications. The second issue is the wealth of evidence which does exist which directly refutes this story. For example, we know that Annie and her daughter Alice were not separated, but still living together at various addresses well into the 1900s. Annie did eventually die in an asylum in 1920, but she was there for epilepsy and doesn't seem to have entered the institution until after 1913. She was also listed as Anglican at the time of her death, not Catholic. The third problem is that there's no logic to the whole thing. There's no evidence the Ripper victims were acquainted with each other or Annie, let alone a tight enough group to be able to hatch a plan to blackmail the royal family. Fourth, and this and the rest of my points continue the theme of no logic, if covering up an illegitimate child was the plan, then killing the mother and the baby and maybe even Walter Sickert would have been the way to go, not a bunch of random prostitutes. Fifth, butchering the women in the way that the Ripper did, which attracted huge attention at the time and continues to do so to this day, was hardly a genius way to hush up a scandalous marriage and child. And if the Freemasons were going around doing things like that, we'd have had a lot more Jack the Ripper style killings in the years in between. Sixth, no such hush-up was ever even needed. Royals have been having illegitimate children since time immemorial and even contracting illegal marriages to Catholics. Here's looking at you, George IV. Until the 1980s at the earliest, it was never possible to prove paternity one way or the other, and the royals and the government certainly didn't run around murdering people to cover these things up. The marriages were deemed void, and where there was a child, sometimes it was acknowledged, sometimes not. There was no reason to worry that a bunch of destitute prostitutes would have been believed either, no matter what story they span. Last but not least, none of the witness descriptions of the Ripper match the elderly and infirm William Gull, nor is there any suggestion that he was a sadistic lunatic, which the real Ripper certainly was. These are just some of the major holes in this fairy tale. If you look up reviews of Knight's book or read Colin Wilson's aforementioned book, which he co-authored with Robin O'Dell, you can find others. I simply don't have time to go through them all here. But really, Knight's work is an embarrassment, and another example of what I mentioned earlier, pseudo-historians making up lies to get attention and money. Incidentally, as I know people are going to ask about this if I don't mention it, I am aware that novelist Patricia Cornwell later wrote a book in which she too claimed Sickert was the killer, and its arguments were equally weak and unconvincing. I hope I've succeeded in persuading you that any claims that Prince Albert Victor was involved, even indirectly, with the Jack the Ripper crimes are unfounded drivel invented by people who were, at best, incompetent, gullible idiots with little to no critical reasoning or source analysis skills, and at worst, immoral, money-grabbing liars who have slandered an innocent man unable to defend himself. To help to protect you from wasting your time and money on pseudo-history like this, I have a free download available on my website, historycallingofficial.com, which offers 5 simple and easy tips for spotting good versus bad history, and it's accessible when you join my mailing list. The site is linked below for you, and you can unsubscribe at any time, though of course I hope you'll stick around for my newsletters, which will keep you up to date with all things History Calling, including upcoming projects. Let me know below why you think crazy historical conspiracy theories like this continue to be so popular with many people, even when the evidence of their fallacy is overwhelming. If you enjoyed this video, you're going to love my Historical Mysteries playlist. It has everything from mysterious disappearances to an infamous skyjacking to cursed diamonds and a supposedly 140-year-old Irish countess. Or you can try one of the other videos I mentioned in this episode if you'd like to follow up on those stories instead. Whatever you choose, please enjoy, and until next time, keep learning.